Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, Ecosystem Services, an NGO Perspective, the second installment of the special series put on by Yale Center for Business and the Environment. This series, Nature's Returns, Investing in Ecosystem Services, is being run this spring, and we'll hear from Sheila Walsh of the Nature Conservancy today. And for those of you who might have missed the first edition, which was a primer on ecosystem services a couple of weeks ago, we'll be posting that online on the CBAY website and on Yale University's iTunes U soon. We're just getting that posted. So you'll be able eventually to revisit all of these webinars. So on to today. I'm Tommy Hayes. I'm a current student at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and the Yale School of Management. Before we get to the presentation, just wanted to remind folks that questions for the speaker can be submitted at any time by typing into the questions box in your toolbar window, and they'll be addressed during the second half of the event. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Sheila Walsh is a senior scientist with the Nature Conservancy's Sustainability Science Program. Sheila's research focuses on how ecosystems and economies are interrelated and how to improve environmental decision-making. The results of Sheila's research supports the Conservancy's mission by helping identify and test conservation strategies that benefit both people and nature. So currently, Sheila is developing methods to incorporate the value of nature into business decision-making through a collaboration with the Dow Chemical Company and Foundation. And she's also investigating how to align marine management institutions from local fishing cooperatives, national policies, with key ecological and economic factors in Mexico. She's previously conducted research on marine ecology, conservation, and economic development issues in Kiribati, Mexico, Belize, and the U.S. In addition to publishing in scientific journals, her research has been featured on media outlets such as NPR and Change.org and has helped inform governments, NGOs, and local stakeholders. Sheila previously was a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Economics and the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Brown University. In 2009, Sheila received her PhD from the Interdisciplinary Program in Marine Biodiversity and Conservation at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in partnership with the Department of Economics at UC San Diego. So Sheila, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, and we're going to get an NGO perspective on ecosystem services.
Thanks, Tommy. Today I'm going to talk to you about how the concept of ecosystem services is playing out for nature conservation NGOs, and in particular, the Nature Conservancy. But first I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I find myself visiting chemical plants more often these days than coral reefs. I started my education with classical training in ecology and evolution at Stanford University. I learned amazing things about how organisms adapt to climate variability, and I wanted to apply this to conservation. Luckily, somebody at World Wildlife Fund listened to my crazy idea about using molecular information to design coral reef marine reserve networks for resilience to climate change. At the age of 22, I was off to Belize leading my own expedition. It was really exciting. The project culminated with a strategy presentation to policymakers and other NGOs. This should have felt like a major achievement for a young marine biologist, but instead I realized that we were focused on Band-Aid solutions and we needed to address the real economic drivers of ecosystem decline. So I decided to study economics. During my PhD, the combination of economics and ecology enabled me to understand the economic drivers of coral reef decline and poverty, and I evaluated conservation development programs in the South Pacific. And now at the Nature Conservancy, as the ecosystem services scientist, I work with diverse groups from fishermen to Fortune 50 companies developing and testing ecosystem service-based strategies, essentially strategies that work to align economic incentives with conservation incentives. A factory may seem like a long way from a coral reef, but my new work with corporations has made me more optimistic about conservation than ever before. In recent years, the conservation community and the Nature Conservancy in particular have also been evolving, and they're thinking about people and nature. So this has made it a special time for me to join the Conservancy. The Conservancy had its origins as a land trust. The founders of TNC were scientists who had the great idea to buy ecologically important and threatened land. Purchasing land was the original market mechanism for conservation. The first purchase was 60 acres along the Mianus River Gorge near the New York and Connecticut border. TNC became known for its pragmatic, non-confrontational, and science-based approach to conservation. TNC also has a history of innovation. Rather than just buying land outright, the Conservancy started working with private landowners to set aside land through conservation easements and to partner with government as early as 1961. And by the 70s, TNC had set the standard for science-based conservation with the database called the Natural Heritage Network, which was used by governments and universities. As TNC passed its 50th year, together with World Wildlife Fund and Conservation International and the Peruvian government, it achieved a landmark deal to protect more than 27 million acres of Peruvian Amazon. This deal meant that TNC had come a long way from the original deal of 6 acres in the Mianus Gorge. However, our current chief scientist, Peter Kariva, estimated that even under optimistic scenarios, we could only protect about 5% of species through the creation of preserves. It was time to move beyond preserves and beyond philanthropy, and ecosystem services provided a framework for thinking about how to do that. Around 2005, there was a very exciting meeting at Stanford with people from the Conservancy and World Wildlife Fund. I was lucky enough to take a break from my extended visit to the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics in Stockholm to participate. The meeting was full of new ideas. The buzz was all about how do we test the hypothesis that investments in nature benefit people, like how these oyster reefs in this picture provide a living breakwater to protect people from storms. And then the other question was, how do we communicate this information to unlikely partners that are more concerned with economic development and human welfare? Now I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking to you about TNC's experience testing and developing these strategies, now that I've given you a sense of where we've been coming from. I'm going to do this by answering 3 questions. First, how are conservation NGOs like TNC shaping investments in nature through ecosystem service strategies? What is new about these strategies? And then what is our vision for ecosystem services, and what are the different obstacles that we've been facing? On to the first question. Okay, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, what are ecosystem services and what is an ecosystem service-based strategy? There's a lot of jargon in this business. Ecosystem services are the benefits that people get from nature. This includes some of the obvious things like water, food, building materials, and some of the less obvious things like crop pollination and climate regulation. Historically, conservation has focused on the impacts that people have on nature and relied on people's love of nature to motivate investments in conservation. But the concept of ecosystem services gives us a new way to talk about how people depend on and benefit from nature. By drawing on economics and other social sciences together with ecology, we can design incentive-based or ecosystem service-based strategies that increase investments in conservation, decrease impacts on nature, and ultimately benefit both people and nature. In this sense, ecosystem services are both an end and a means. They are a means because they help us motivate investment in nature. They are also an end because we're aiming to protect nature that benefits people, not just nature for nature's sake. TNC's ecosystem service work can be categorized in 4 main areas. The first essentially looks like our regular conservation, where we're working on the ground with philanthropic dollars or with partners. But in this case, we're investing in protecting and restoring places that have benefits to people, such as these oyster reefs along the Alabama coast. The second area of work is shaping and influencing policy. We were part of the working group that created the Oregon Ecosystem Services and Markets Bill that supported the creation of ecosystem markets. We also provided critical scientific capacity to create an accounting framework that would help make these markets a reality. This is just one example of our policy work. The third area of work is in market-based mechanisms, which includes payments for ecosystem services. One example is our water funds projects, which invest payments from water users into conservation in order to secure clean water. The fourth area of work is our newest. This involves developing methods for others, such as corporations, to integrate the value of nature into their decision making. In some ways, this work is the most different, but it also has the greatest potential to come to scale. Rather than us doing the on-the-ground conservation, we expect that the investments in nature will come from businesses and others seeing that it makes good economic sense. Next, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into examples of the last 2 areas of work in order to answer my second question. And that question is, well, what is new about these ecosystem service-based strategies? First, these strategies are about benefits to people and nature. They're about protecting places that provide water, clean air, essential natural resources, and recreational opportunities. This changes the business model of conservation to one where we are dealing with people who are looking for a direct return on investment and not just interested in philanthropy. This means that we are engaging with new partners whose interests suddenly seem aligned with conservation, such as water utilities and chemical companies. We are working in new places. We move beyond the borders of preserves and into areas that are surprising from a biodiversity standpoint. We are developing new science that integrates ecology with economics to inform decision making. We are also going to scale, not just by buying more land, but replicating novel mechanisms or planting the seed for changes in practices. So I've talked in generalities here about what's new, but now I'm going to get specific with a few examples. And I'm going to first talk about what is new about our water fund strategy. But first, what is a water fund? We have 2 models, water funds and water producers. In a water fund, water users make payments into a fund that supports conservation activities in the watershed, while in the producer model, these payments are made directly to farmers or ranchers to protect or restore forests alongside rivers. We currently have 15 funds and 7 producer programs in various stages of development across South America. Here in this slide, I've got a picture of the Quito Water Fund, where monthly payments from water and electric companies go to protecting watersheds to supply Quito's 2 million inhabitants with 80% of their fresh water. These water funds represent new funding mechanisms for conservation. The goals and metrics of these programs are also new. The goal for the 25 projects across South America is to conserve 7 million acres and secure water for 40 million people. We are measuring our success toward the triple bottom line of biodiversity conservation, securing water, and improving livelihoods of people in the watershed. On the right here, I've got a map of water funds in the northwestern part of South America. Our team from the Latin America region is almost done with the first round of evaluation for 4 of these sites, the stars here on the map. And the data in so far are looking good. Water funds are also about new partners. Together with the FEMSA Foundation, IDB, and GEF, we launched the Latin America Water Funds Partnership. This is the world's first initiative to engage private sector, public sector, and civil society in a watershed conservation strategy. This partnership will address the critical challenge of the fact that 1 in 8 people in Latin America lack access to clean drinking water. Now I'm going to change gears and talk to you about our corporate practices work. Working with corporations to change practices is a key strategy for us because corporations have major impacts on nature, but they also depend on nature. Changing corporate practices may be much more cost-effective for us than working with all the individuals that buy products from corporations. Moreover, changing practices through the development of new methods and tools to value nature has a great potential for leverage, because if we can show that using these tools leads to better business outcomes, we expect that other businesses would adopt these practices too. Our 5-year collaboration with the Dow Chemical Company is a great example of this new area of work. So that was the conservation case for working with businesses, but now what's the business case for working with conservation or investing in nature? So businesses have a very good understanding of their manufactured capital and increasingly their human capital, but they have very little information about the hidden assets and liabilities that come from nature. We hypothesize that by integrating the value of nature into business processes, businesses will improve their decision making. This may lead to improved business performance and conservation outcomes, and it may ultimately inform public policy. We're testing this hypothesis through the 5-year collaboration with the Dow Chemical Company in 3 pilot sites. Our first pilot site is in Freeport, Texas, where we're investigating 3 priority ecosystem services. And those are freshwater, coastal natural hazard mitigation, or the protection that marshes or dunes provide from storms, air pollution mitigation via tree planting. I'll talk to you a little bit about our freshwater work just to give you a taste of what we're doing. Freshwater is a critical input to most businesses, and unlike oil and gas, businesses rarely have market prices to guide strategic planning. In order to help Dow make better decisions about water, we're answering the following research questions. First, what is the future value of water to Dow, as well as other stakeholders in the area, and to ecosystems? And how is this going to change under future climate change and demand scenarios? And then secondly, we're going to answer the question of what are the best on-site and off-site responses to future water? And we're going to try and expand the solution set from traditional engineered solutions to nature-based solutions. In the short term, the outcomes of this collaboration are going to be new tools and methods for businesses to make better decisions. And we're also going to, we think, advance conservation strategies as well as ecosystem services science. In the long term, we expect that this could lead to systematic changes in the ways that businesses make decisions and ultimately lead to wide-scale investment in nature that makes business sense. So that leads me to the last question. What is our vision for ecosystem service strategies? And what are some of the obstacles that we've been facing? Well, simply put, the vision is grand. It's systematic and widespread investments in nature that benefit people. This would be a world where there's good information about when investing in nature makes economic sense, and these investments are facilitated by good public policies and private practices. This would be a world in which the devastating impacts of Katrina could be mitigated through cost-effective investments in restoration, and the cost of relief funds are reduced dramatically. The Nature Conservancy has been working on investing in nature through restoration projects with NOAA. This map shows over 100 of our projects that have occurred in the last 10 years. This includes everything from restoring oyster reefs, salt marshes, to coral reefs. We are now working to show the return on investment of these projects. In Alabama alone, TNC has restored over 100 million miles of oyster reefs. The initial results for the ROI analysis being completed by my colleague Tim Kroger and Jim Boyd show benefits in terms of jobs, enhanced fish catch, and enhanced profits for businesses above the cost of restoration. One more note there. And in fact, restoration projects funded through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds created 5 times as many jobs as the median ARRA stimulus grant. So this shows that the return on investment in restoration actually could be quite high. So we're really excited about these types of numbers. But it has also presented challenges to our traditional way of thinking about conservation. There's definitely been a lot of dialogue in the halls of the Nature Conservancy offices, in our various science chronicles and other online venues for interacting with each other. And just to give you a sense of some of the debate, I'm going to walk you through a thought experiment. So imagine you were trying to decide where to restore oyster reefs. On the left-hand side of the slide, I have a picture where I'm showing a marsh, and let's imagine it has lots of rare species. And on the right-hand side, you have an area with a housing development. If you were to prioritize biodiversity, you might choose the left side. But if you wanted to benefit people as well, you might choose the right side because the value of the services is higher. So you can imagine that an analysis shows you something like this. You've got pretty low biodiversity values on the right-hand side, but you've got high values from things like denitrification. So this is getting nitrogen out of water, or from fish and crab production, or from protection from storms. So this shows how ecosystem services puts us in a place with multiple objectives. It's not just about biodiversity, but also about biodiversity and benefits to people. Luckily, lots of times, the places that have high biodiversity values also have high ecosystem service values. And there, the decisions are pretty easy. But when there's a trade-off, and places with high ecosystem service values actually have low biodiversity values, then decisions become more difficult. So some parting thoughts on the NGO perspective on ecosystem services. This is definitely an exciting time to be in an NGO. We're bringing together new areas of science. So we've got ecology working together with economics and other social sciences. We're working with new partners like corporations. And this is because ecosystem services provides us a way to think about aligning conservation incentives with economic incentives. I highlighted some of the things that are new about this work. For me, certainly, a lot of the excitement comes from the science, so developing the ecology and economics for valuing nature. But it's been especially exciting doing this with new partners like Dow Chemical Company. Back in undergrad, I actually started a course called Business and Environmental Issues at Stanford, and so I feel like I've come full circle, and it's really exciting to be sitting down at the table with these folks trying to figure out new methods and solutions and putting them to the test. And back at TNC, there's a lot of excitement around our new goals, but purchasing land and biodiversity still remains at our core. And like I said, going from coral reefs to chemical plants has actually made me really optimistic, because I think this new type of work, using ecosystem service-based strategies, may be a way to systematically change environmental decision making and increase investments in nature. I'd be really excited to take any of your questions about our work at the Nature Conservancy, or the science about the science of ecosystem services, or any of the other topics that I touched on.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Sheila, for that presentation. And we will move right into the question and answer segment now. So for folks in the audience, go ahead and drop your questions, type them into the question box, which should be in your toolbar. So actually, I want to start out, actually, Sheila, with a bit about your private partnership work with Dow Chemical. I personally came from time in the NGO world, and private partnerships were, constantly something we were looking at and trying to learn from and figure out how to do them better. Do you think that, absent some sort of high-level policy, that private partnerships are going to be sort of the name of the game for a while?
Well, I think that there's definitely a lot of interest in moving towards working with corporations. I think there's, like I said, there was a point in the Conservancy's history where there's a realization, we can't obviously buy all the land to solve these problems, and it can't. And that's not even the point. It's not about protecting nature from people, but more sustainably using resources. And really, the only way then to get to scale is going to be to work with others. And there's been a long history of working with governments, but working with corporations and other private other entities has a huge attraction, because they depend on nature a lot, they have big impacts, and they're also very dynamic and exciting organizations where a lot of innovation occurs. So yeah, I do think it's going to be an increasing part of what we do, but it certainly won't be the only thing, or the main thing for that matter.
Yeah, thank you. Similar question from Jeffrey online, who was wondering, what specifically motivated Dow's change of practice? I mean, was it that you kind of presented them with sort of an economic scenario they just couldn't turn down, or was it a combination of factors? Can you speak to kind of how you were able to employ their partnership?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad somebody asked. So it's a neat story. Dow was looking into these sort of issues. They were seeing that there were certain risks associated with ecosystem decline, but that there might be opportunities. That this concept of ecosystem service indicates that. And at the same time, the Nature Conservancy was thinking about, well, how do we go to scale? How do we really promote sustainable use of natural resources, and how we develop an area of corporate practices? And so actually what happened was that Dow had been doing their own work and developed a proposal for the work that turned out to be strikingly similar to the proposal of work that we had. And I think, we didn't just come to this place out of nowhere. There was a great history of interaction between Dow and the Nature Conservancy in Michigan at first, where their headquarters are based, and then in Brazil, where they had supported our water funds through a philanthropic endeavor, and seen great benefits from that interaction, and were interested in a partnership that went beyond philanthropy. So there was a history of interaction and an evolution of both organizations at about the same time.
Great. Question from Jason, who was wondering about the international programs that you mentioned. Are those programs voluntary, or do they require regulatory input in the countries that you're undertaking the project?
Like the water funds, for instance?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they're primarily voluntary. So one thing that's really interesting about our international programs is, to them, this ecosystem, and when I'm saying international programs, like the people that work for us in other countries, to them, ecosystem service-based strategies were always a way of doing business because they, in general, were having to be more concerned about benefits to people to motivate conservation. And in the case of the water funds, these payments are primarily voluntary because people are seeing that it makes sense, that there's a payoff.
Okay. Thanks. I had a question from Suzanne. Hoping you could give us some examples of the ecosystem services models or evaluation approaches that TNC is using showing return on investment.
So, right. So probably the best example is the one that I hinted at with oyster reef restoration. I actually, this is perfect. I have a slide queued up next with some results, initial results. So it's not necessarily about specific models, but just applying standard economic analyses to evaluating the return on investment for oyster reefs in this case. So here, what I'm showing is that there's for a 3-mile stretch of oyster reefs in Alabama, the cost of restoration was over $4 million. And then Tim and Jim looked at the economic inputs or impacts to 2 counties from construction and fisheries enhancement. So they're looking at outputs, so increased fish catch, earnings, and jobs. So some of this is from original. Some of the results come from original survey-based research in the area, and then that's complemented also with data on published parameter estimates for the impacts of some of these particular activities. But this work did have a significant amount of on-the-ground research being done, and so it was a really, really exciting. We still have some work to do on getting the estimates of benefits for reduced coastal erosion and flooding, and so that kind of gets at some of the models you might be wondering about. So the Nature Conservancy is a founding partner of the Natural Capital Project, and through that project, we've been developing, or the scientists in that project have been developing ecosystem service models, and the coastal protection one is one that we're trying to apply in the context of oyster reefs for this particular project, and it's still a work in progress, but we're hoping to have results soon.
Great, thanks. So a question from Maura, who was wondering if PNC is undertaking much primary research to monetize some of these services, or if you're relying more on existing literature, and she mentions benefit transfer for the valuation component of these kinds of studies.
Yeah, that's a great question too. So again, like sort of with the oyster reef example, well, I'll talk about a Dow example. How about that? So with the work with Dow Chemical Company, say when we're talking about freshwater, there's lots of different values that come from freshwater, right? So there's inputs to Dow's production, there's drinking water for municipalities, there's recreational uses, and so what we're doing is we're trying to evaluate decisions based on how those values might change. And so the values that we'll assess depend on the question at hand, and then we essentially are prioritizing which values we definitely need to estimate monetarily to get to a good decision, and which could be biophysical measures, or which could even be qualitative measures. And when it comes to the monetary values, a lot of those are going to be using original research. A few which are maybe going to be less important to the decision, or where there's good benefit transfer data available, then we'll be using that. So a lot of it is about the question about the priorities for making good decisions and about data availability.
Great, thanks. The question from Deb Carey, who asks, I think she was looking at the example where you had the bar graphs comparing the two restoration options, and she's wondering if ecosystem services valuation still biases the equation towards humans rather than biodiversity. Since we don't ensure biodiversity, that doesn't innately balance, the equation towards human development. So can you speak to, how you kind of weigh those factors against each other, kind of the human benefits and the biodiversity?
Yeah, so it's all about a value judgment, right? And, dollars is one way to measure value, and biodiversity, there are ways to measure the value of its existence in dollars, but you're sort of suggesting, well, okay, if we're not measuring it in dollars, are we necessarily biasing against it? Well, there's certainly methods for essentially weighting biodiversity versus, or essentially multiple outcomes. And that's one approach. But I wouldn't say that we're inherently weighting one thing versus another in any particular case. And to a great extent, these decisions are going to depend on the specific situation and the people involved.
Great, thanks. So I have a several-part question from Mark. He was curious about some of the risks of this strategy. I think he means the corporate partnerships. For example, he says, many corporations actively undermine the establishment of or violate environmental laws, in the pursuit of profit. He's wondering about sort of greenwashing. What evidence do you have that this strategy will be a game changer and not just, nobody can just call it greenwashing? Or are you working to use this strategy to maybe build political support for a more robust regulatory policy someday?
Yeah, well, I think there's two pieces there. One, it's an experiment, so that's what makes it really exciting. And I'm a scientist, and we have a bunch of scientists working on this, and we definitely try and remind people that it's a hypothesis that providing better information about the value of nature and integrating that into business decisions will lead to better business outcomes and conservation outcomes. So we don't know. This is something we're testing, but if we don't try and test this, then I would think that the value of nature is going to be even less likely to be recognized. So in the sense of, is this greenwashing or not? I mean, I think, okay, maybe Dow is getting something good out of interacting with us, but at the end of the day, we're just testing scientific hypotheses, and we're trying to develop methods. And so the real judgment will come whether those methods can be applied and are applied, and what results from that. So I think that's really a key thing here. We're not advocating for one thing or another. We're trying to develop new science and new methods. And then I think the last thing that you asked about was policy. And so we would hope that if it is appropriate, if we find cases where we're identifying places where investments in nature might benefit the public and corporations, but that there's a need for an institutional or regulatory change, that would be supported.
Thank you. I have a question from my classmate Heather, who asks, actually we had a lot of questions about the work in Latin America and the water fund partnerships. Heather specifically asked how you're measuring success in the different watersheds, and then second question was, do you have any plans to expand the program into other countries or watersheds within the countries you're already working in?
Yeah, so we're initially we have been doing evaluation at 4 well-established sites that where we're measuring 3 main areas of outcomes. One is biodiversity conservation. The other is ecosystem services, so the provisioning of water. And thirdly, socioeconomic factors, so our how our livelihoods of the people in the watershed who receive the payments or are affected by the conservation programs, how are they changing? And we are planning to expand water funds in South America. So as I mentioned, we've got 15 water funds and 7 of the producer initiatives, which are the direct payments, in various stages of development throughout South America. And with the Latin America Watershed Partnership, we are supporting this expansion through other parts of Latin America.
Great, thanks. And actually, we had a request from Julia to ask that you expand on the water fund producer model and how it works. And maybe it's worth just going back to that slide, because these concepts are kind of new to me anyway, probably to a lot of people. You know, if you could expand on what those are, just so people have a better sense. Yeah, it was pretty early on in the presentation.
Yeah, so here it is. So the water producers is a direct payment to people who live in a watershed to that are conditional on them protecting or restoring forest or other natural habitats alongside a river. And so that's a little bit different than the water funds, where things are happening a little bit more indirectly, where water users are putting money into a fund that supports community-wide conservation projects rather than directly making payments to the farmers or the ranchers. So here, with the water producers, well, really sort of with the water producers, one of the incentives for them is obviously this direct payment. So it's so that helps in the sense that, you know, it's providing another source of income, hopefully alleviating poverty to some extent. But then we also are working on demonstrating, or well, not demonstrating, but testing whether or not protecting some of these areas along stream beds actually benefits the farmers or ranchers themselves, but indirectly through preventing erosion and securing, you know, water in the watershed, not just to downstream users.
Thanks, appreciate it. We have a nice variety of questions that I think speaks to the diversity of our audience. Question from Annalise, who asked, what do you think the role of banks might be, perhaps eventually, on ecosystem services? Maybe that's part of your vision for where ecosystem services might go, but someday do you think there will be a bigger role for banks?
Yeah, well, the water funds is involving the Inter-American Development Bank already, so that they're part of the Latin American Water Funds Partnership. And I had the exciting opportunity to head over to IDB with our CEO and see the president of IDB, and his staff and various other folks from TNC were there. And the conversation really was about the alignment between economic development, which is more their business, and conservation. And their Sustainable Cities initiative is very much interested in water funds and how they are a method for securing water for growing cities throughout the world. Well, specifically in Latin America, but potentially in other places as well. So in that sense, we have a major bank being involved.
Cool. Thanks. Question from Jason again, who asks if land tenure has been an issue in some of these programs, and specifically, do rural residents have title to land in some of the places you're working?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, we're working in fairly diverse areas, so I can't really speak to all of them. But for instance, in the Quito watershed, or no, I shouldn't use that example. I'll use the produce, because that's a water fund. But the one of our water producers initiatives outside of Sao Paulo, the direct payments are being made for changes on their land, and so that was a hurdle, you know, that needs to be overcome. Whereas that wouldn't have worked in a place where there weren't secure, there isn't secure land tenure. But I can't speak to the details of land tenure issues in all of the sites. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, I had a question from Jeffrey, who noticed the slide you had that mapped out the various ecosystem services projects around the country, around the United States, and he noted that they were, or appeared to be, all in coastal zones. So he was wondering if there are examples of inland projects that you're working on, or is it primarily a coastal kind of activity?
Oh, sorry for the confusion. So that map was just supposed to be showing an example of one area of work with coastal restoration. Actually, a lot of our ecosystem service work is terrestrial. So the water funds, of course, are terrestrial. We also have the work in Oregon with ecosystem markets. We have a great program in Pennsylvania and other areas nearby called Working Woodlands, where we work with private individuals to get value out of the various ecosystem services coming from their land, and support Forest Stewardship Council certification. And then our work with Dow, for instance, is a mix of, well, at least for the first pilot site, is 2 terrestrial projects and 1 coastal zone project. So no, it's a real mix of all sorts of projects.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks for the clarification. So I have a question about models or ideas that might capture non-economic values. And so Kirsten writes that she's doing research on forest restoration, ecosystem services, and livelihoods in Mongolia. And there's interest in non-economic valuation tools and how it can influence policymaking, even though economic valuation often receives the majority of the attention. So even though she says she knows your expertise is on ecological economics and environmental science, but have you encountered any models that might capture cultural, spiritual, existence value, aesthetic value better than others?
So that's a really great question, and also I think the reality is that a lot of ecosystem service models actually aren't necessarily measuring things in dollars. So a lot of times, because of different technical challenges, or because decision makers actually really just want relative metrics, people are using either biophysical metrics, so that could be like gallons of water, or sort of indicators. And we also have our senior social scientists definitely working on a lot of issues around social values. So I think although we often are talking about economic value, there's lots of different ways in which we can communicate about value, and the fact is people are already doing that, and that it's going to be certain cases where dollars is what people need or want. Businesses are going to be probably more interested in that, but there's going to be other decision makers who don't need those types of metrics.
Great, thanks. Well, I'm just going to ask one more question, and several people have written in. It's kind of a softball. Where can folks go to find more information about this leading edge work by TNC and others, perhaps? If you have any good resources, people from, sounds like, around the world would be interested in some places they can go. And I'll mention that I will circulate Sheila's slides, but in addition to that, do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, for sure. So you can definitely look at our homepage to see some of the work we're doing. Like, you can learn more about water funds, or you can learn more about the Dow project. We have our first year annual report for the Dow project up there. You can also go to the Conservation Gateway. That's another website. It's more supposed to be like a resource about some of this type of information. I think those are two of the main places. And then the other place where people might want to go is the Natural Capital Project website to see some of the background on ecosystem services and one application, one set of tools that people are trying to use for looking at ecosystem services.
Great. What was the second website you mentioned, Sheila? After Nature Conservancy's website.
Conservation Gateway.
Conservation Gateway. Great. I'll circulate those three
resources. If people are more interested in business and ecosystem services, obviously, like I said, there's our specific work with Dow and our corporate practices work, which is on our homepage, which is nature.org. But a recent publication that would be of interest and sort of lays out a lot of the framework and the rationale is the Corporate Ecosystem Service Valuation Report by WBCSD and BSR. So that lays out a lot of the rationale. The business case gives some nice background and some examples of some of the beginning efforts of businesses to apply these concepts.
Perfect. Thanks. Well, with that, I think we can close. I'd like to thank everybody in the audience for joining this hour. We are now 2 down and 1 to go in our Nature's Return series. An email will be going out early next week, the invitation and registration link for our 3rd and final event, which will be an investor's perspective. We'll have Cliff Sunda from Working Lands Investment Partners talking to us about his experience. And yeah, I'd just like to thank Sheila Walsh for joining us today. This whole event will be recorded and posted eventually, and I'll send out an email with including Sheila's slides and a few of the resources that she recommends for follow-up information. So Sheila, thanks a lot, and everyone will hopefully talk to you in a couple weeks.
Yeah, and thanks so much for the questions.
Yeah, appreciate it. All right, thanks.